The flight attendant stopped beside the teenage boy in first class and said, "There must be a mistake. You don't belong in this seat." Seconds later, a white woman pointed at him and demanded, "Move! That's my seat. I always sit there." But no one knew. The boy they were trying to remove was the son of the man who owned the entire airline. And what happened next changed everything. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell icon so you never miss the next one. There was a moment of uncomfortable silence as Zayden stepped into the first-class cabin. Dressed in a clean hoodie, jeans, and simple sneakers, he looked calm and quiet, holding his boarding pass in one hand and a book in the other. Most passengers barely noticed him until he walked over to seat 1A and sat down. That's when Linda, a woman in her mid-50s wearing a cream-colored pantsuit, turned her head sharply. Her eyes locked onto him with instant disapproval. She stared like he had made some kind of mistake. Without saying a word, she leaned toward the flight attendant and whispered something under her breath. The flight attendant, Jenna, nodded slightly and began walking toward Zayden with a professional smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Excuse me," Jenna said in a gentle but firm voice, tilting her head slightly. "Can I see your boarding pass, please?" Zayden looked up from his book, polite and calm, and handed it over without hesitation. She glanced at it and blinked, then looked back at Linda, who was now watching closely with a smug expression. "This is seat 1A, Jenna said slowly, like she wasn't quite sure what to do next. "Yes," Zayden replied. "That's what it says on my ticket." Jenna's smile tightened. "Would you mind moving? We have a guest who usually takes this seat." Zayden looked at her confused. "Sorry, but this is the seat I chose when I booked the ticket. I even paid extra for the extra legroom. I'd prefer to stay here." Linda let out a loud sigh. "He must have used someone else's points or a special discount. I always sit there," she said, making sure other passengers could hear. One man across the aisle looked over. Another woman in the next row lowered her phone and started listening. "He's a platinum member," Jenna added quietly, trying again. "This is her usual spot." "I understand," Zayden said gently, "but I'm also a platinum member. I booked this seat myself. I'm not moving." Linda scoffed and shook her head. "This is exactly why standards are falling. First class used to mean something. Now anyone can walk in here with a cheap hoodie and act like they belong." Zayden remained quiet. His face was calm, but he didn't look away. He turned back to his book, but his silence said everything. Jenna stood there for another second, clearly unsure what to do next. Then she turned and walked toward the front of the cabin, glancing back once more at Zayden, with a look that felt less like concern and more like warning. Linda leaned back in her seat with her arms folded. "People like that don't belong in seat 1A, she said loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. Zayden didn't flinch. He didn't argue. But in his lap, his phone lit up with a message. "Let me know when you're seated, Dad." He read it, locked the screen again, and quietly returned to his book. No one on that flight knew who Zayden really was. Not yet. But they were about to find out, and it would be a moment none of them would forget. The cabin began to settle as final passengers boarded, but the tension around seat 1A hadn't gone unnoticed. Several people had already whispered about the awkward scene. A man in business attire had his phone tilted just slightly, already recording. A college student seated 2 rows back kept glancing up from her screen, earbuds still in, eyes locked on the situation. Zayden remained silent, calm, focused, but his eyes weren't on the page anymore. They were staring through it, waiting. Linda wasn't done. She pressed the call button. Within seconds, Jenna returned, this time with the cabin supervisor, Brent, following closely behind. Brent looked serious, his voice deeper and more commanding. He leaned slightly toward Zayden and lowered his voice, but not enough to stop nearby passengers from hearing. "Sir," he said, "we've had a complaint from one of our premium passengers. Would you mind switching seats just for the comfort of everyone?" Zayden looked up slowly. "I have my assigned seat. I'm not breaking any rule." Brent nodded stiffly. "That's not what I'm saying. We're just asking—" Zayden interrupted, still polite, but firmer now. "I booked this seat, I paid for it, and I'm staying here." Linda scoffed again. "Unbelievable. This is exactly what I mean. He probably bought it on points or something. He doesn't belong here. I paid full price. Brent glanced at her, then back at Zayden. Sir, please understand. We're trying to avoid any trouble. Zayden raised an eyebrow. I'm not causing trouble. I haven't said a word to her. She's the one who keeps making comments. Linda smirked, then leaned over and whispered just loud enough. No need to get sensitive. Some of us are just used to a certain level of service. Another voice from row 2 spoke up. He hasn't done anything wrong. He's sitting in his assigned seat. Why are you bothering him? Jenna and Brent both turned toward the passenger who had spoken, caught off guard. Then Brent took a small step back, cleared his throat, and said, We'll be back shortly, before walking toward the front. Zayden sat still, expression unreadable. In his lap, his phone buzzed again. He glanced down at it. Captain just texted me. Said you're on board. All good. Let me know if they treat you right. He didn't reply. Linda turned toward the window, clearly annoyed that Zayden was still there. She muttered one more time, I swear this airline is falling apart. Zayden exhaled quietly and looked forward. He wasn't angry, not yet. But behind that calm face, something was shifting, and every second that passed was bringing the rest of the truth closer. Up at the front of the cabin, Brent was already speaking in a hushed but urgent tone to the captain. Captain Nolan, a man in his late 50s with a practiced calmness, listened with furrowed brows. Jenna stood beside them, arms crossed, her eyes glancing toward the first-class cabin where Zayden sat. It was clear they hadn't expected resistance. Normally, people just moved. I don't care who booked what, Linda was now saying loudly to no one in particular. This is first class, not a youth hostel. Several passengers shifted in their seats. The man recording earlier now had his phone resting on his knee, camera still running. A young woman leaned across the aisle to whisper, Is she serious right now? Her seatmate nodded slowly. Back at seat 1A, Zayden reached into his backpack and pulled out a protein bar. He peeled it slowly, unbothered, as if nothing around him mattered. But every move he made was being watched now. Brent returned with Captain Nolan right behind him. The captain wore the kind of expression that tried to look neutral, but failed. He walked up to Zayden and bent slightly to meet his eye level. Good afternoon, the captain began. We've had a bit of a situation. One of our regulars is feeling uncomfortable. Would you be willing to help us out by switching seats? Zayden didn't even blink. With all due respect, I have an assigned seat. I didn't ask to be moved. I'm not the one making comments. I'm just sitting where I'm supposed to. Captain Nolan pressed his lips together. I understand, son, but sometimes it's better to avoid confrontation. Zayden finally set his protein bar down and looked the captain directly in the eyes. Why am I the one expected to avoid it? Why not the woman who keeps saying I don't belong here? Nolan straightened, caught off guard by the directness. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Linda cut in sharply. Because some of us actually fly this airline every week. That's why. And we don't need to be disrespected by some teenager trying to act important. That was when Zayden calmly reached for his phone and tapped on the screen. He opened a message thread and typed just 3 words. It's happening again. Then he hit send. Brent leaned down again, clearly frustrated. Sir, we can do this the easy way, or we can call airport security. Your choice. Zayden placed his phone face down on his lap. I already made my choice, he said firmly. I'm not moving. Across the aisle, the businessman with the phone whispered, This is going to be a mistake they'll regret. But it was already too late for regret. The silence in the cabin grew heavier with every passing second. The tension wrapped itself around the room like a rope pulled too tight. Zayden remained seated, calm but unmoving. Brent and Captain Nolan exchanged glances. This wasn't going the way they expected. Passengers had stopped pretending not to listen. A few had their phones angled just enough to record everything. Then something unexpected happened. Linda stood up. She reached into her handbag and pulled out a neatly folded bill, then walked straight over to Jenna, the flight attendant. With practiced ease, she slipped the money into Jenna's pocket and said in a low, clear voice, Thank you for helping with this little mess. Some of us still appreciate good service. Several passengers saw it. One of them, a woman sitting 2 rows back, caught it clearly on video. Jenna didn't respond. She just nodded stiffly and turned toward the front of the plane, her face suddenly flushed. Zayden saw it too. He said nothing, but his eyes followed every move. Brent, now more irritated than before, leaned back toward Zayden's seat and lowered his voice. This isn't just about a seat anymore. It's about the comfort of our top passengers. You're making a scene. Zayden tilted his head slightly. I haven't raised my voice. I haven't left my seat. I haven't broken any rule. If there's a scene, it's because someone else doesn't like the way I look. Brent opened his mouth to reply, but was cut off by a loud, exaggerated sigh from Linda. I'm going to miss my meeting because of this nonsense, she groaned. I don't care if he has a ticket. First class should feel like first class, not like a school trip. Another passenger spoke up. This is embarrassing. For the airline, not him. He's done absolutely nothing wrong. Brent's face reddened. His voice dropped to a near whisper as he leaned closer to Zayden. Sir, this is your final chance. Either you cooperate or we call security to remove you from the flight. Zayden didn't move. He just picked up his phone again and calmly opened the camera app. Without a word, he tapped record and held the phone steady. I just want to be clear, he said calmly, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. I'm being threatened with removal from my assigned seat, which I paid for, simply because someone doesn't like me sitting here. Brent's jaw tightened. Recording isn't permitted on this flight. Zayden raised an eyebrow. It's not illegal to record if it's for personal protection and doesn't interfere with operations. You should know that. That moment shifted everything. Brent straightened quickly and stepped back, visibly rattled. Jenna avoided eye contact. Linda crossed her arms with a smirk, as if she believed none of this would matter. But across the cabin, a dozen phones were already filming, and the story was no longer under their control. The cabin felt like it had frozen in time. The quiet hum of the plane, the soft chime of a boarding announcement, none of it reached the ears of the passengers anymore. All attention had zeroed in on seat 1A, where Zayden sat with his phone resting on his lap, camera still recording. His face was calm, but his eyes were sharp. He didn't need to argue. The truth was speaking loud enough on its own. At the front of the plane, Captain Nolan returned to the cockpit, but not before casting one last uncertain glance at Brent. Brent, visibly flustered now, stepped away and took out his service phone. He began whispering rapidly into the receiver, his back turned, but his body language betrayed the pressure he was feeling. Meanwhile, Jenna moved toward the galley, walking fast, head slightly down. She wasn't smiling anymore. She was no longer in control of the situation, and the weight of the moment had finally caught up with her. She thought back to the money Linda had handed her just minutes ago, money that now felt like poison in her pocket. Linda, still standing, looked around the cabin and noticed the change. People weren't ignoring her anymore. They were watching, judging. A few were clearly recording, but she didn't back down. Instead, she straightened her jacket and said loudly, "This is what happens when rules stop mattering, when any kid off the street can pretend to be first class." Zayden didn't even glance in her direction. He was now scrolling through his messages. Then, with a quick movement, he typed out a reply. "Still in my seat, being recorded and threatened. Just a heads up." Seconds later, his phone buzzed with a response. "We're monitoring it. Don't move. Let them finish what they've started." Down the aisle, Brent ended his call and walked quickly back toward Zayden, but he wasn't alone. Two airport security officers, both wearing blue jackets with ID badges and radios, followed behind him. The sight of them caused a stir through the cabin. Passengers shifted in their seats. A few gasped quietly. One man whispered, "They're really going through with it?" Brent stood beside Zayden again, now with the added presence of authority behind him. One officer, a tall man with short-cropped hair, stepped forward. "Sir," he said in a steady voice, "we've been asked to escort you off the plane due to a disruption." Zayden looked up at the officer. "What disruption?" he asked plainly. "I haven't done anything." The second officer shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Brent. The unease was obvious. The entire cabin was watching. "I'm sitting in the seat I booked. I haven't argued. I haven't caused trouble. The only thing I've done is stay here while someone else says I don't belong." The taller officer hesitated. "We understand, but we've been called to remove you from the flight. Please gather your things." Zayden nodded once. He didn't yell. He didn't cry. He didn't beg. He placed his phone gently into his backpack, zipped it closed, and stood slowly. The room was silent. Even Linda had gone still, though her eyes sparkled with satisfaction. Zayden turned to Brent as he picked up his bag. "You should remember this moment," he said, "because it's going to matter a lot more than you think." Then he stepped into the aisle, flanked by the two officers, and began walking toward the exit. As he passed Linda's seat, she leaned back and whispered, "Finally." But what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the moment Zayden took that first step off the plane, something far bigger had already been set in motion. The recording was already uploading, the messages were already read, and the person on the other end of Zayden's phone wasn't just watching, he was preparing to respond. Zayden stepped off the aircraft with quiet, measured steps. The two security officers flanked him but didn't touch him. Their pace was slow, as if they too sensed the weight of the moment. He walked past curious passengers in the boarding tunnel, many of whom had overheard fragments of the incident and now stared in disbelief. A few even pulled out their phones, whispering, "Was that the kid they just kicked off?" Zayden said nothing. He didn't look around. His back was straight, and his grip on his backpack was steady. He had been through things like this before, but this time was different. This time they had no idea who they were dealing with. As he reached the gate area, one of the security officers gently asked, "Do you have someone we can call for you?" Zayden looked at him briefly and responded, "No need." They already know. Then he walked to an empty seat near the large terminal windows and sat down. Meanwhile, inside the cockpit, a radio call came through on Captain Nolan's private channel. His expression changed almost instantly. The voice on the other end was calm, but direct. "This is Aviation Administration. We've received a complaint of racial discrimination from a platinum passenger who was removed from Flight 717. Can you confirm the name?" Nolan hesitated. "Yes, it was a young man, Zayden Monroe." There was silence on the other end for a few seconds. Then the voice returned, sharper now. "Zayden Monroe is the son of Damon Monroe, chairman and majority shareholder of this airline, and he's scheduled to meet the Aviation Oversight Committee this evening." Captain Nolan dropped his pen. "Wait, what?" "Get off that flight and report to the executive line immediately. Legal is already involved. We've received video footage from passengers. It's spreading fast." Back in the first-class cabin, Linda was sipping champagne, finally pleased that the issue had been resolved. She had her seat back. She had silence. And in her mind, that was all that mattered. Jenna came over and gave her a forced smile. "Sorry again for the trouble, Miss Wexler," she said. "Oh, don't worry about it," Linda replied smugly. "Some people just need to learn where they belong." But far from the plane, the situation was unraveling faster than she could imagine. Zayden, now seated near Gate 44, had already uploaded the footage from his phone to a private legal channel. Moments later, his phone rang. The caller ID showed "Dad, private line." He answered without hesitation. "Are you okay?" Damon Monroe's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, controlled fury. "I'm fine," Zayden replied. "They made it clear I didn't belong, even after I showed my pass." "You recorded it?" "Everything." There was a pause. "Good," his father said quietly. "Sit tight. They're about to learn who belongs and who doesn't." At that same moment, inside Skylink Airlines headquarters, on the 34th floor of a high-rise building overlooking the city, the company's CEO, Russell Grant, was staring at a tablet. On it was a video already gaining hundreds of thousands of views. Zayden, seated calmly, refusing to give up his seat. Linda, slipping money to Jenna. Brent, threatening removal. The captain doing nothing. Grant didn't say a word. He turned the tablet around so his chief legal officer could see it. "Who approved his removal?" he asked coldly. The legal officer didn't respond immediately. "Do you know who that is?" Grant continued. "That's Damon Monroe's son, and he just got kicked off his own plane, on camera, because a woman said he didn't belong." Another video popped up. A second passenger had uploaded footage from another angle. Different voice, same scene. Grant stood up slowly. "Call the flight, pull the captain, pull the crew, and get me Damon Monroe on the phone. Now." Back at the airport, Zayden's phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't a text, it was a news alert. Teen removed from first class after passenger's complaint. Footage sparks outrage online. And just like that, the story had left the plane. Now it was flying on its own. The video was everywhere. By the time the aircraft taxied to the runway, the incident had already become the top trending story across multiple social media platforms. Clips from 3 different angles were circulating, each showing Zayden calmly defending his right to sit in the seat he had paid for, and the crew's increasingly aggressive efforts to remove him. But the footage that had struck the internet hardest was the one where Linda clearly slipped a folded bill into Jenna's pocket, followed by the smug comment, "Some of us still appreciate good service." The internet didn't miss a beat. Hashtags like Duryuri first class bias, Shiri Zayden Monroe, and Skylink discrimination shot to the top of trending lists. Influencers were reacting, news anchors were requesting interviews, and public figures were condemning the airline's behavior within minutes of the story breaking. In the meantime, Flight 717 remained in the air, unaware of the full storm brewing below. Linda, reclined in seat 1A, was sipping a second glass of champagne, still basking in her small victory. She scrolled through her phone, frowning slightly at the lagging Wi-Fi. Behind the scenes, Skylink's crisis team was working at full speed. The communications director, Marcia Patel, was sitting in a glass-walled office across from CEO Russell Grant. Her phone was buzzing nonstop with alerts, media requests, and internal messages. She had already been forced to cancel her dinner plans, and now she was pacing the room barefoot, heels kicked off under the desk. "The video's real," she said, holding up a tablet. "The payment, the removal, the comment about people like him. There's no way to spin this." Russell Grant rubbed his temples. "What's the reaction like?" "Brutal," she replied. "We're being dragged by civil rights groups, airlines analysts, celebrities, schools, even our own frequent flyers. Half of them are threatening to cancel their memberships. Stock is already down 5% and falling." The chief operations officer entered, looking pale. "We just got confirmation," he said quietly. "That was Zayden Monroe, Damon Monroe's son." Russell slowly looked up from his desk. "Did he use his father's name?" "No," the COO admitted. "He booked the ticket under his own name, paid full price, didn't ask for any special treatment." "So he got treated like every regular person," Russell said, his voice bitter, "which in this case means like garbage." Back at the airport lounge, Zayden was still seated by the window. His posture hadn't changed, but his phone hadn't stopped buzzing for the last 30 minutes. Friends had started texting, reporters were emailing. A popular sports figure had just reposted his video, calling the incident a perfect example of how quiet racism hides in plain sight. Then a soft voice spoke beside him. "Excuse me," a woman said, clutching her phone nervously. She looked like she was in her 20s, clearly a fellow passenger. I was on the plane. I saw everything. I recorded the whole thing." Zayden looked up at her, expression still calm. She held out her phone. "This angle shows everything. The crew trying to push you, her bribing the flight attendant, you saying nothing aggressive. It's all here." Zayden nodded once. "Can you send it to me?" She nodded quickly and did just that. As the file transferred, she added, "I also want to testify if needed. What they did to you, it's not right. It shouldn't happen to anyone." "Thank you," Zayden said. It was the first time his voice softened. Meanwhile, on board the aircraft, Captain Nolan's phone lit up with a flashing alert, one reserved for internal corporate emergencies. He read the screen and his face went pale. Brent, who was standing in the galley with Jenna, noticed. "What's wrong?" he asked. The captain looked up. "The boy we removed, he owns us." Brent blinked. "What?" "His father is Damon Monroe, the chairman. He owns the controlling stake in Skylink." Jenna's mouth fell open. That can't be right. He didn't say anything." "No," the captain said grimly. "He didn't have to." Within 10 minutes, a direct order from corporate grounded the flight upon arrival. The crew was to remain on board and await instruction. A team from Skylink's executive office would meet them at the terminal. The atmosphere changed instantly. Brent looked down the aisle, his hands suddenly clammy. Jenna began wiping her palms on her uniform, face flushed. Linda still didn't know. She was laughing at something on her phone, completely unaware that every step of her triumph was about to collapse beneath her. The seat she thought she won, it was about to cost her everything. By the time Flight 717 touched down, the damage had already reached executive levels, financial markets, and legal departments across the country. Skylink Airlines was in freefall, publicly, professionally, and morally. Their inboxes overflowed with angry customer messages. Sponsors were demanding answers. Travel bloggers, news outlets, and advocacy groups had latched onto the story, dissecting every second of footage, frame by frame. The video clips had now been viewed more than 9 million times, and counting. At the airport, a private Skylink operations team waited just beyond the gate, composed of senior managers, a company lawyer, but the footage that had struck the internet hardest was the one where Linda clearly slipped a folded bill into Jenna's pocket, followed by the smug comment, "Some of us still appreciate good service." The internet didn't miss a beat. Hashtags like Duryuri first class bias, Shiri Zayden Monroe, and Skylink discrimination shot to the top of trending lists. Influencers were reacting, news anchors were requesting interviews, and public figures were condemning the airline's behavior within minutes of the story breaking. In the meantime, Flight 717 remained in the air, unaware of the full storm brewing below. Linda, reclined in seat 1A, was sipping a second glass of champagne, still basking in her small victory. She scrolled through her phone, frowning slightly at the lagging Wi-Fi. Behind the scenes, Skylink's crisis team was working at full speed. The communications director, Marcia Patel, was sitting in a glass-walled office across from CEO Russell Grant. Her phone was buzzing nonstop with alerts, media requests, and internal messages. She had already been forced to cancel her dinner plans, and now she was pacing the room barefoot, heels kicked off under the desk. "The video's real," she said, holding up a tablet. "The payment, the removal, the comment about people like him. There's no way to spin this." Russell Grant rubbed his temples. "What's the reaction like?" "Brutal," she replied. "We're being dragged by civil rights groups, airlines analysts, celebrities, schools, even our own frequent flyers. Half of them are threatening to cancel their memberships. Stock is already down 5% and falling." The chief operations officer entered, looking pale. "We just got confirmation," he said quietly. "That was Zayden Monroe, Damon Monroe's son." Russell slowly looked up from his desk. "Did he use his father's name?" "No," the COO admitted. "He booked the ticket under his own name, paid full price, didn't ask for any special treatment." "So he got treated like every regular person," Russell said, his voice bitter, "which in this case means like garbage." Back at the airport lounge, Zayden was still seated by the window. His posture hadn't changed, but his phone hadn't stopped buzzing for the last 30 minutes. Friends had started texting, reporters were emailing. A popular sports figure had just reposted his video, calling the incident a perfect example of how quiet racism hides in plain sight. Then a soft voice spoke beside him. "Excuse me," a woman said, clutching her phone nervously. She looked like she was in her 20s, clearly a fellow passenger. I was on the plane. I saw everything. I recorded the whole thing." Zayden looked up at her, expression still calm. She held out her phone. "This angle shows everything. The crew trying to push you, her bribing the flight attendant, you saying nothing aggressive. It's all here." Zayden nodded once. "Can you send it to me?" She nodded quickly and did just that. As the file transferred, she added, "I also want to testify if needed. What they did to you, it's not right. It shouldn't happen to anyone." "Thank you," Zayden said. It was the first time his voice softened. Meanwhile, on board the aircraft, Captain Nolan's phone lit up with a flashing alert, one reserved for internal corporate emergencies. He read the screen and his face went pale. Brent, who was standing in the galley with Jenna, noticed. "What's wrong?" he asked. The captain looked up. "The boy we removed, he owns us." Brent blinked. "What?" "His father is Damon Monroe, the chairman. He owns the controlling stake in Skylink." Jenna's mouth fell open. That can't be right. He didn't say anything." "No," the captain said grimly. "He didn't have to. Within 10 minutes, a direct order from corporate grounded the flight upon arrival. The crew was to remain on board and await instruction. A team from Skylink's executive office would meet them at the terminal. The atmosphere changed instantly. Brent looked down the aisle, his hands suddenly clammy. Jenna began wiping her palms on her uniform, face flushed. Linda still didn't know. She was laughing at something on her phone, completely unaware that every step of her triumph was about to collapse beneath her. The seat she thought she won, it was about to cost her everything. By the time Flight 717 touched down, the damage had already reached executive levels, financial markets, and legal departments across the country. Skylink Airlines was in freefall, publicly, professionally, and morally. Their inboxes overflowed with angry customer messages. Sponsors were demanding answers. Travel bloggers, news outlets, and advocacy groups had latched onto the story, dissecting every second of footage, frame by frame. The video clips had now been viewed more than 9 million times, and counting. At the airport, a private Skylink operations team waited just beyond the gate, composed of senior managers, a company lawyer, and as the door opened and the three were let out one by one, it was clear. The story they thought they had controlled had become something far bigger, and the one person they tried to silence was now the reason everyone was listening. The fallout wasn't limited to the airport. By the next morning, Skylink Airlines' name was everywhere, from morning talk shows to evening news specials. The company's polished slogan, "Excellence for every passenger," was being ruthlessly mocked online. A viral clip stitched the slogan with the footage of Zayden being escorted off the plane, then cut to Linda's voice. "Some of us still appreciate good service." The contrast was brutal. Comment sections filled with outrage, calls for boycotts, and screenshots of canceled memberships. In the midst of the storm, Skylink's boardroom was tense. The senior executives sat around a long glass table, eyes locked on the massive screen at the front. It was paused on a still frame from the viral video. Zayden sitting quietly in seat 1A, surrounded by crew members looming over him. CEO Russell Grant stood at the head of the table, arms folded tightly across his chest. His voice was controlled, but every syllable carried weight. "This isn't just a viral moment," he said. "It's a breakdown in everything we claim to stand for. We didn't just discriminate against a customer. We humiliated the son of the man who owns 37% of our shares and has personal partnerships with half the companies we work with." The CFO leaned forward. "Stock dropped 14% overnight. Our investor line hasn't stopped ringing. The media is calling it the first-class incident," the marketing director added. "They've turned it into a case study in racial and class bias. This will be taught in business schools by next semester." Another executive chimed in nervously. "Have we spoken to Damon Monroe directly?" Everyone looked toward Russell. "I spoke to him last night," he said. "He wasn't yelling. He didn't threaten. He just said, 'You've shown me exactly what you are when you think no one important is watching.'" A long silence followed. "We spent 2 years building a partnership with his AI firm," the COO said quietly. "That was going to be a $50 million contract." "It's already gone," Russell replied. "Canceled this morning." A low murmur spread through the room. The reality was sinking in. Not only had they destroyed a deal, they had embarrassed the one person who had quietly been one of their greatest supporters. "He doesn't even want an apology," Russell continued. "He wants an emergency shareholder meeting. Today." Across town, Zayden sat quietly in the back seat of a black SUV, his phone resting in his palm, as the vehicle pulled up to Skylink's corporate headquarters. He wore the same simple jacket and jeans from the day before. Nothing flashy, nothing new. Just the same quiet presence that had drawn so much attention 24 hours earlier. His father, Damon Monroe, sat beside him, dressed in a dark suit with no tie. His face was unreadable, eyes locked on the building ahead. "They're going to try and apologize," he said calmly to his son. Zayden nodded. "Doesn't change what they did." "No," Damon replied, "but it changes what we'll do next." When they entered the building, the staff at reception stood up without a word. They didn't ask for ID. They didn't check names. Everyone already knew. They were escorted upstairs to the executive conference level. The moment Damon stepped into the boardroom, every director and senior manager stood. Not out of respect, out of fear. Zayden followed closely behind him, his gaze steady, moving from face to face, each one responsible for decisions that led to his removal, his humiliation, his silence. Russell Grant stepped forward nervously. "Mr. Monroe, we deeply regret." Damon raised a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "I'm not here for regret," he said. "I'm here for accountability." He turned to face the board. "You judge my son not by his ticket, not by his name, not by his behavior, but by your assumptions. You treated him like a threat, when all he did was sit in his assigned seat and ask to be treated like everyone else." The room was silent. No one interrupted. No one dared. "My family owns more of this company than any other entity, and yet even my son isn't safe in your cabins. That tells me something's broken." He placed a slim folder on the table. "This is my condition for remaining invested in Skylink. Effective immediately, I want a full internal investigation, public transparency, the permanent dismissal of all involved staff, and a mandatory company-wide bias training initiative. Every employee from ground crew to top management goes through it. Or I walk. And when I walk, so does the investment. And so does every strategic partner we brought with us." The legal officer tried to speak. Damon cut him off again. "This isn't a negotiation. This is the minimum required for this company to survive." Zayden didn't speak. He didn't have to. His silence was louder than any of their apologies. He just sat beside his father, the same way he had sat quietly in seat 1A, peaceful, steady, unbending. Russell's voice cracked slightly. "We'll comply, immediately." Damon nodded once. "Good." He stood up, turned to Zayden, and said, "Let's go." And just like that, they walked out. No anger, no theatrics, just quiet power. But as they left, every executive in the room knew they hadn't just lost control of a situation. They had handed it to the one person they tried to erase. In the 72 hours that followed, Skylink Airlines entered a phase no one in its three-decade history had ever seen: complete operational lockdown. Across every airport where the airline operated, flights were grounded. Gates remained closed. Call centers were flooded, not just with questions, but with outrage. News helicopters circled Skylink's major hubs, capturing long shots of grounded aircraft in deserted terminals. Commentators called it the first corporate timeout in aviation history. But behind the scenes, the company was scrambling to keep itself from falling apart. An internal memo, personally approved by CEO Russell Grant, was sent to every employee, over 18,000 staff members worldwide. It read, "Skylink Airlines will pause all passenger operations for the next 48 hours to conduct mandatory emergency training on anti-bias conduct, ethics, and passenger rights. This is not punishment, it's a reset. Every staff member will participate, including executives." It was a bold move, and it came with a price. Every minute the airline sat still was costing hundreds of thousands of dollars. But they had no choice. Public pressure had made the decision for them. Sponsors had pulled funding, government agencies had requested records, and Damon Monroe's demand for transparency meant every step would be watched, not just by customers, but by the world. In a large converted conference room at Skylink's headquarters, rows of employees sat in stiff chairs, watching the incident play out on screens. The footage was paused at key moments. Zayden handing over his boarding pass, Linda rolling her eyes, Brent leaning over with a subtle threat in his tone. Then the part that made everyone in the room uncomfortable, the silent, clear moment when Linda slipped the money into Jenna's pocket. Each time the video paused, the room sat in heavy silence. No one had to explain what went wrong. It was obvious. The training was not a lecture, it was a reckoning. The instructors, part of Monroe's own diversity and ethics division, didn't sugarcoat anything. They asked hard questions. What would you have done in Brent's place? How many times have you assumed someone doesn't belong based on how they look? Would you have stood up for him or stayed silent like most of the cabin? In one session, a veteran flight attendant broke down in tears. "I've seen this before," she said. "Passengers get treated differently all the time. And we move on." Another added, "It's not just race. It's age, clothes, accents. We judge people the second they walk on board." And then a voice from the back of the room said quietly, "This time, we judge the son of the man who signs our checks." But even that wasn't the point. The message was clear. It never should have mattered who he was. It should have mattered how he was treated. At the same time, Damon Monroe and Zayden were in a smaller room across the building, sitting with a group of Skylink's most senior leaders, including Russell Grant. Damon wasn't there to punish. He was there to ensure permanent change. "People ask me why I let my son fly commercial," Damon said, his tone steady. "Why not use the jet? Why not send him with a security detail?" He looked around the table. "I wanted him to understand how people get treated when they have no title. No wealth to flash, just a boarding pass and a name. I didn't expect that lesson to come at this cost, but now the whole company has learned it too." Zayden sat beside him, hands folded. His voice was calm when he finally spoke. "I wasn't angry that they asked me to move," he said. "I was angry because they assumed I didn't belong without asking a single question. They decided who I was before I even opened my mouth." He looked directly at Russell. "You can't train kindness, but you can remove the people who fail to show it. You can build a culture where everyone gets treated like they paid the same price." Russell nodded slowly. "We're working on it. You have my word." Zayden gave a small nod. "Then start by clearing that seat, 1A, for the next kid who looks like me. So when he sits down, no one dares to think twice." That afternoon, Skylink issued a public statement across every platform. "We failed one of our passengers, and we did it on the world stage. For that, we are ashamed, but we are not silent. Every member of our airline is currently undergoing mandatory bias and empathy training. We are overhauling policies, removing the individuals involved, and rebuilding trust, not just with one family, but with every person who has ever felt unseen while traveling. This is not just a response. This is a new beginning." Attached was a press image, Zayden standing at the center of a training room, speaking to employees, not as a victim, not as the CEO's son, but as a reminder of how dignity should never be optional. The photo spread like wildfire. One caption under the image read, "The quietest person on the plane became the loudest voice in the room." And somewhere in a crowded terminal, a young boy watched the clip on his phone, turned to his mother and asked, "Mom, could I ever sit in first class?" She smiled gently and said, "Yes, baby. Now you can." In the weeks that followed, the transformation at Skylink Airlines went beyond words, beyond apologies, and even beyond public relations. What had started as a viral scandal was now shaping into a massive industry-wide example of what accountability could look like when the person holding the company to the fire wasn't trying to destroy it, but to make it better. The airline didn't just quietly terminate the 3 employees at the center of the incident. Brent, Jenna, and Captain Nolan. Their dismissals were made part of the training modules as cautionary examples. Their actions were dissected not to shame them, but to teach others what silence and bias looked like in real time. For the first time in company history, Skylink released an internal misconduct review to the public, including full transparency reports on all discrimination complaints from the past 5 years. It was brutal, honest, and necessary. But for Brent, Jenna, and Captain Nolan, the consequences didn't end with job loss. Their names had already circulated online, attached to headlines and screenshots. The internet had not been forgiving. Brent spent his days glued to a laptop in a small apartment far from the airport. He had applied to over a dozen airlines, regional, charter, even freight, only to be met with polite rejection emails or complete silence. One interview ended 5 minutes after the recruiter recognized his name. He sat in front of his television one night, watching a news segment about corporate bias, and saw his own face on screen, caught in a frame where he leaned over Zayden with that smug, dismissive expression. He quickly turned the TV off, but the silence afterward was even louder. Jenna had tried to return to hospitality. Her resume still carried years of flight experience, but every interview circled back to the same question. "Were you involved in that viral Skylink case?" Eventually, she stopped applying altogether. She avoided social media. Friends she'd known for years had quietly distanced themselves. One of them texted her after watching the full video, writing, "I didn't know you could be like that." That single sentence haunted her more than the rest of the fallout combined. Captain Nolan, once considered a decorated veteran of Skylink's fleet, had his pilot license still intact, but no airline wanted to touch him. His name had become a legal liability. At first, he had tried to justify his silence. He hadn't seen the whole thing. He trusted his crew. But deep down, he knew he had watched it unfold and chosen to do nothing. It was easier, safer. At least that's what he thought at the time. They each had their own private regrets, and they each had to live with the same truth. Their decisions, small as they might have seemed in the moment, had destroyed their careers. Meanwhile, Skylink was rebuilding. New protocols were rolled out across every department. Passengers were now guaranteed the right to remain in their assigned seats without being moved for the comfort of others. Any customer request involving seating changes had to be documented and approved by 2 crew members and flagged in the flight record. Cash exchanges between passengers and crew were explicitly banned and punishable by immediate termination. Anonymous reporting tools were made available to all flight staff and passengers, with direct lines to internal oversight, not filtered through supervisors. But perhaps the most meaningful change came in the form of a new program called Grounded in Respect, an employee-wide training initiative funded by Damon Monroe himself and developed in partnership with Zaden. Unlike standard training courses, this wasn't a checkbox exercise. It involved simulated scenarios using real actors, real reactions, and debriefs led by behavioral psychologists. It was uncomfortable, honest, raw, and it was working. Passengers noticed. Subtle things began to change. Gate agents smiled more. Not the forced customer service smile, but the kind that acknowledged people as human. Flight attendants listened before assuming. Complaints dropped, compliments rose. Skylink's customer satisfaction scores across minority passengers, especially young Black and Latino travelers, began to climb for the first time in over a decade. Journalists who had first covered the scandal returned to do follow-ups and were shocked by what they found. One reporter from a major outlet wrote, "We expected damage control. What we found was cultural rebirth." Zaden didn't seek the spotlight during any of it. He didn't attend the press conferences. He didn't sit on panels or do interviews. He returned to his college classes, finished his exams, and quietly turned down multiple documentary offers. But one day, Skylink posted a photo of him standing in a training room, surrounded by new recruits. No caption, no press, just a photo of the kid who had been judged, rejected, and pushed out, now shaping the way new employees would treat every future passenger. A soft revolution had begun, not with lawsuits, not with violence, but with 6 simple words. "I'm just sitting in my seat." And those words would echo through every Skylink cabin from that day forward, not just as a memory of what had gone wrong, but as a reminder of what would never be allowed to happen again. 6 months later, the name Zaden Monroe was no longer just associated with a viral injustice. It had become a quiet symbol of accountability, grace, and corporate reform. Skylink Airlines, once a standard industry player known for its luxury branding and predictable performance, was now recognized for something far deeper: cultural transformation. The company had done more than to survive the scandal. It had evolved because of it. Every new hire at Skylink, whether for baggage handling, flight crew, or executive teams, was now required to pass through an intensive onboarding module titled Perspective Matters. The course began not with corporate videos or motivational quotes, but with the full, uncut footage of the first-class incident. No narration, no edits, just raw reality. They watched the slow humiliation, the condescending tones, the bribery, the silence of crew members who could have spoken up, but chose comfort over courage. And then they watched how it all unraveled. For most, the video was difficult to watch. For some, it was life-changing. Zaden had visited one of the training centers 3 times, not as a speaker, not to retell the story. He simply showed up, sat quietly in the back, and answered questions when asked. At the end of one session, a newly hired crew member approached him and said, "I wasn't there when it happened, but I carry the weight of it. Thank you for staying calm. Most of us wouldn't have." Zaden responded with only 3 words. "I didn't have to." It was true. He didn't have to be the one to hold composure. He didn't have to remain silent or polite or logical in the face of injustice. But he had. And because of that, the story had reached people who otherwise would have dismissed it. Because of that, the airline had no excuses left. The impact rippled beyond Skylink. Other airlines began requesting access to the training program. Universities used the case in ethics and corporate responsibility courses. Even Fortune 500 companies contacted the Monroe Foundation, asking for workshops and consultations. What began with one moment of discrimination had grown into a movement for institutional accountability, but not everyone had moved on. Brent, the former cabin supervisor, had been quietly working through a personal transformation of his own. Out of work, publicly shamed, and socially isolated, he had been forced to confront parts of himself he had ignored for years. For the first few months, he was bitter, angry, certain that he had been treated unfairly. But then, he watched the video again. Not through the lens of denial, but through the eyes of everyone else. He saw the smirk on his face. He heard the tone in his voice. He finally listened to how Zayden had spoken. Never rude, never loud, never disruptive. That was the moment Brent stopped blaming and started learning. He enrolled in community programs about racial literacy and unconscious bias. Not because he had to, but because he realized he'd never truly understood the weight of his actions. Not until now. Eventually, Brent applied for a role in Skylink's Second Chance program, a newly formed rehabilitation initiative created by the Monroe Foundation for individuals who had lost their jobs due to discrimination-based incidents, but had since demonstrated genuine change. It wasn't a shortcut to redemption. The program was rigorous, demanding, and emotionally raw. Participants had to undergo regular psychological evaluations, contribute to community outreach, and participate in real-world scenarios where they were placed in uncomfortable, high-stakes social dynamics. Brent passed. So did Jenna. Captain Nolan, now too old to return to the cockpit, became a case study for the program, his name mentioned in some sessions as an example of passive leadership failure. But rather than disappear into the background, he reached out to the program and requested to volunteer, not as a leader, but as a learner. He offered to help write new case simulations. He sat in the back of classes. He listened, and slowly a different kind of story began to grow. Not one about shame, but about growth. One afternoon during a program review meeting, Zayden was handed a folder. Inside were reports from the Second Chance program, the stories of individuals who had failed once, owned it fully, and earned their way back. He flipped through the pages silently until he reached one with Brent's name. Attached was a short letter addressed to him. Zayden, the day I stood over you and asked you to move, I saw myself as the one with power. But you taught me that real power is the ability to stay kind in the face of disrespect. Thank you for making me face who I was. I've been trying every day since to become someone better. Print. Zayden closed the folder and looked out the window. He didn't smile. He didn't tear up. He simply nodded, as if the letter wasn't a surprise. Just the next natural step in a story that had never been about revenge, but about accountability. And it was working. For the first time, Skylink Airlines wasn't just promising dignity to its passengers, it was delivering it, seat by seat, face by face, one changed person at a time. Skylink Airlines, once just a name in the competitive race for luxury and convenience, had now become something else entirely, an emblem of painful lessons, earned redemption, and a cultural shift rooted in humanity, not marketing. The company's stock, which had plummeted in the wake of the incident, slowly began to climb. Not because of clever branding or short-term damage control, but because of trust. Investors, passengers, and even former critics began to view Skylink not as a perfect company, but as a transparent one. A company that had bled in public and had the strength to heal in full view of the world. Media coverage shifted from outrage to curiosity. Documentary crews requested behind-the-scenes access to the training rooms and policy meetings. Industry insiders were invited to observe board discussions that were once held in complete privacy. The old guard of Skylink, executives who once ran on status and image, were steadily replaced with a new generation of leaders, many of them from communities that had been marginalized in the airline industry for decades. Every 6 months, the company now hosted a Culture Accountability Summit, where employees shared anonymous experiences, data was presented on progress, and passengers were invited to speak directly to leadership. Zayden never spoke at those summits. He never sat on the stage. He always sat somewhere in the audience, quiet, listening. He said from the beginning he didn't want to be the face of the company's recovery. He just wanted to be the reason it changed, and that wish had come true. Passengers noticed something different now, not just in how they were treated, but in what wasn't happening anymore. There were no whispers when someone young, black, or casually dressed entered first class. No side glances when a teenager with locks pulled out a first-class boarding pass. No forced smiles followed by policy explanations. It wasn't perfect, but it was noticeably better. Airline review blogs began ranking Skylink not only for punctuality and comfort, but for equity of experience. One travel writer wrote, "There's something radical about being treated like you belong, especially when you've spent your whole life being told you don't." Skylink didn't just change, it evolved. The Monroe Foundation, now an essential partner to Skylink's internal leadership, launched a public initiative called Belonging in the Skies, a nonprofit that offered free legal resources, public education tools, and scholarship funds for students pursuing aviation careers who came from communities most often discriminated against in travel. Zayden kept his role quiet. His name was listed on the board, but his work was done behind closed doors, in draft documents, training outlines, and one-on-one mentorship with applicants. But one event was impossible to keep quiet. Exactly 1 year after the original incident, Skylink held its first class for all event, an initiative designed to celebrate inclusivity by gifting surprise upgrades to youth from underserved communities. Each selected traveler received a handwritten letter, a new suitcase, and a seat in first class. The program was designed to give the experience that Zayden had been denied, but more importantly, to normalize the presence of people from every background in every seat. The press release was clear. No one should be treated like a guest in their own seat. At the airport, volunteers from the Monroe Foundation were waiting with cameras and smiles as teens arrived for their surprise upgrades. One boy, about 14, held his ticket and stared at it in disbelief. "This is really first class?" he asked a staff member. "Yeah," she replied, smiling. "That's your name. That's your seat." A journalist nearby asked him how he felt. The boy looked around, eyes wide, then said, "I feel like I matter." That quote landed on news tickers around the world. In the crowd, tucked into the background near Gate 47, Zayden stood with a hood pulled over his head, watching quietly. He had refused the spotlight again. No interviews, no speeches, no center stage. But one of the new volunteers recognized him and approached. "Can I say something?" she asked gently. He looked at her and nodded. She hesitated, then said, "You didn't just change the airline. You changed what people think is possible." Zayden gave a small smile, his first of the day. "We're all just trying to get where we're going," he said. She laughed lightly. "You just made the ride a little more fair." As Zayden turned back toward the window to watch the planes move in the distance, he felt no need to say more. The incident that had once humiliated him had become a blueprint. The injustice that tried to silence him had become a megaphone for others. He didn't have to fight anymore. The world was already listening. 12 months ago, Zayden Monroe had been quietly escorted off a flight for doing nothing more than sitting in the seat he paid for. Today, that same airline had become a model of change, proof that corporations could do more than apologize, that they could rebuild from the ground up if held accountable by the right voices. But not all stories moved forward in headlines. Some lingered behind closed doors in quiet offices and in people who still carried the weight of who they used to be. In a modest training facility miles away from the airport, Brent stood in front of a group of new recruits, his shirt tucked in, his voice steady, though softer than it used to be. The name badge he wore didn't say supervisor, it said training assistant. He wasn't in charge anymore, but he was present, and that in itself was a kind of victory. On a whiteboard behind him was a list of case studies. At the top, Flight 717 incident. "I was part of that flight," Brent said plainly, meeting the eyes of the room. Not in the good way. There was no pride in his voice, no defensiveness, just truth. "I made assumptions. I valued one passenger's comfort over another's dignity. And I ignored what I knew was wrong because I thought it would be easier. He paused, letting the silence settle. But it wasn't easier. It was just quieter for a moment. Then the noise came, and I had to live with it. The trainees didn't speak. They were listening, really listening, in a way people rarely do when watching corporate training videos or reading manuals. Because this wasn't a lesson, it was a confession. Brent continued, "I'm not here to make you feel bad. I'm here to help you recognize the moment before the mistake, that tiny space between action and assumption. If you can catch it there, you won't end up where I did." He stepped aside, letting the screen behind him light up with the now infamous footage. Zayden's calm, Linda's sneer, the bribe, the silence. But Brent didn't watch the video anymore. He already knew every frame by heart. Outside the training center, Jenna waited on a bench, her clipboard resting on her lap. She wasn't a flight attendant anymore. After months of counseling, community work, and deep personal reckoning, she'd been invited to join the ground team at Skylink's Second Chance Division. She didn't lead sessions. She helped organize them, greet attendees, prepare materials. It was a humble job, but she welcomed it. She'd stopped wearing makeup the day she realized she had used her smile as a mask. Now she smiled less, but meant it more. When the session ended, Brent walked outside and saw Jenna. They exchanged a look, not quite a greeting, but a quiet understanding. She stood up and walked beside him. "How'd it go?" she asked. "Better than I deserve," he said. She didn't correct him. They both knew the road was long, and it wasn't about deserving anything. It was about earning back trust, little by little, every day. Across the country, Captain Nolan had found a different kind of purpose. Unable to fly commercially again, he took a role as a consultant with aviation ethics boards. He spoke to pilots in training about leadership failures, not as a cautionary tale, but as someone who had failed, owned it, and chosen not to disappear. In one closed-door panel with veteran pilots, he spoke plainly. "I stood back when I should have stepped forward. I protected the process instead of the person, and it cost me my uniform." He looked down at the table. "Don't let it cost you yours." None of them had been offered public redemption. There were no headlines celebrating their growth. But in the background, where real change always begins, they were rebuilding, just like Skylink. Back at Skylink headquarters, Russell Grant stepped into a quiet corner office. He had considered resigning more than once. He had failed to see what was happening under his leadership, failed to respond fast enough when the scandal broke. But Damon Monroe had asked him to stay. "Not because I trust you blindly," Damon had said, "but because I want to see if you can do better." Russell took that seriously. Every major policy now required review by an independent ethics board. Every executive bonus was tied to culture performance, not just profits. And every month, Russell received a report, not from marketing or PR, but from Zayden's team. It was called the Integrity Index, a detailed report that measured real-time feedback from passengers, crew interactions, complaint resolutions, and incident data. It had started as a temporary experiment. It was now the most valued document in the company. That afternoon, Russell read the latest summary. Passenger complaints down 61%. Discrimination claims reduced to near zero. Internal employee satisfaction up 47%. 94% of passengers surveyed feel equally respected regardless of class, appearance, or background. He closed the report slowly and sat back in his chair. The numbers didn't erase what had happened, but they told a new story, a better one. At an airport hundreds of miles away, a young black boy boarded his first plane. He clutched his ticket tightly, eyes wide as he followed the signs to gate 18. His mother walked beside him, holding his small suitcase. They reached the gate just as boarding began. The boy handed his pass to the agent, who scanned it and smiled genuinely. "You're in seat 1A today," she said. "Enjoy the flight." His eyes grew even wider. "Really? That's up front, right?" "Yes," she nodded. "Right up front." He turned to his mother. "Are you sure this is okay?" She kneeled down and looked at him gently. "It's more than okay. That seat is yours. Don't ever let anyone make you feel like it's not." He smiled and walked ahead. And as he stepped into the plane, he didn't see whispers or raised eyebrows or doubtful glances. He just saw a seat with his number on it, and he sat down, confident, comfortable, ready to fly. Just like anyone else, the boy in seat 1A looked out the window as the plane rolled gently onto the runway. He had never been this close to the front of anything before. He gripped the armrest for a moment, unsure of what to expect, then settled into the wide leather seat, legs swinging slightly, his backpack tucked beneath his feet. The flight attendant passed by, paused, and smiled. Not a trained, distant smile, but a warm one, real. "First time in first class?" she asked kindly. He nodded. "Well," she said, adjusting his seatbelt gently, "you belong here." Simple words, but they landed with weight. Across the airport, in a quiet lounge overlooking the terminal, Zayden Monroe sat alone at a corner table. No cameras, no press, just a laptop open in front of him, a coffee slowly cooling to the side. His phone buzzed with an update from Skylink's internal dashboard. The system his team helped build was now active in all departments. Real-time bias alerts, employee behavior tracking, anonymous passenger feedback, and ethics flagging tied directly to promotion paths. What began as his story was now hundreds of stories. A system, a culture, a force behind the scenes making sure no one else had to prove they belonged in the seat they already earned. Zayden closed the laptop. The work was still far from over, but it was working. A staff member approached and handed him a sealed envelope. He nodded, accepted it, and waited until they walked away. Inside was a letter from one of the newest trainees who had just completed the Second Chance program. The handwriting was rough, the sentences not polished, but the words were honest. "I never knew how much damage I caused until I saw it from the other side. You didn't curse us. You corrected us. That's something I'll carry for life. Thank you for making space for people like me to grow, even when we were the ones who made you feel small." Zayden folded the letter and slid it into his backpack alongside a growing stack of others like it. Below him, the boy's plane began lifting into the air, wheels tucking into the belly of the aircraft, nose angled into the sky. Inside seat 1A, the boy leaned into the window, wide-eyed, breath held as clouds swallowed the wings. He didn't know Zayden Monroe was somewhere nearby. He didn't know the seat he was sitting in had once been the center of a battle that nearly broke a company. He didn't need to, because the point of the fight was never attention. It was transformation. And the proof of that transformation wasn't in the headlines or the apologies or the policies. It was in this one ordinary moment. A boy in his seat looking out the window, flying like he always belonged, because now finally he did. If this story moved you, give it a thumbs up and share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear what you think. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss more powerful stories like this one.